Motion 20. Je reconnais le député de Portland-Simmons.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I move the following resolution, seconded by the MLA for Hampton. Whereas Policy 409 concerning multi-year school infrastructure planning is intended to give a clear direction to decision-making for closing schools, and whereas the same policy has instead created confusion amongst members of the school community, has been perceived to be properly implemented by various education district councils, and whereas the policy has created division and torn communities apart as opposed to uniting them, and whereas such a government policy should be designed to bring New Brunswickers together using an independent facilitated process, and whereas it has become apparent over the last number of years that parents, students, teachers and community members are dissatisfied with the Policy 409 process, be it therefore resolved that this Assembly urge the government to halt all current school sustainability assessments and conduct a review of Policy 409, and be it further resolved that the review of Policy 409 include a robust, public and facilitated province-wide consultation process.
Motion 20. Motion 20 de la part du député de Portland-Simmons, appuyé par le député de Hampton. La résolution suivante. Attendu que la politique 409, qui est celle de la planification pluriannuelle de l'infrastructure scolaire, vise à orienter clairement la prise de décision applicable à la fermeture d'écoles, attendu que la politique a plutôt suscité la confusion parmi les gens du milieu scolaire et que divers conseils d'éducation de district l'aperçoivent comme ayant été incorrectement mise en œuvre, attendu que la politique a été un facteur de division et que, au lieu d'unir les collectivités, elle a semé la discorde au sein de celles-ci, attendu qu'une telle politique gouvernementale devrait être conçue pour unifier les gens du Nouveau-Brunswick par la voie d'un processus indépendant et simplifié, attendu qu'il devient évident depuis un certain nombre d'années que les parents, les élèves, le personnel enseignant et les gens de la collectivité sont insatisfaits du processus entourant la politique 409, qu'il soit à ces causes résolu que l'Assemblée exhorte le gouvernement à cesser toute étude de viabilité d'école qui est en cours et à examiner la politique 409, et que l'examen de la politique 409 inclut un nouveau processus rigoureux et facilitant de consultation publique menée à l'échelle provinciale. La parole est au député de Portland-Simmons.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, today we're looking for unanimous consent of this motion and unanimous support of this motion. This motion is to review a policy that basically governs how schools are used on a multi-year basis and potentially closed. And the policy dates back to September of 1998. So let's put this in perspective. This is a policy that's almost 20 years old. It has been carried out over 5 different premiers. Madam Speaker, this is not a policy that is the responsibility of any one government or any political stripe. Quite frankly, this policy has been in place for a number of years with some minor modifications during that period. But I'm going to state from the onset that this policy has created some of the most division in our communities around this province that I have ever seen. I don't believe that's intentional, but Nonetheless, that kind of division has occurred as a result of this policy. So all we're asking for at this point is that this Assembly unanimously urge government to put a halt to any 409 processes going forward until we have a chance to review this policy. And with that, we need a province-wide public consultation, and I'm not talking about something that's going to take a couple of years or even any more than 3 or 4 months, but simply an engagement process around the province to get feedback from community leaders, from educators and parents as to how we can improve this process. Now, I don't know whether Policy 409 is broken, whether it's misunderstood or it's misused, or it could be a combination of all three, Madam Speaker. But consistently, I have watched communities become very divided, torn apart, with district education councils that quite frankly are just doing the best that they can do based on the policy that they were given and their interpretation of that policy. And I would suggest that there are times when I don't believe the policy is as restrictive as certain districts believe that it is. And I was very proud to be part of a government many years ago that gave local control back to the community through locally elected district education councils, because I believe that these kind of decisions need to be made at the local level. Our job as provincial politicians, whether we're in government or we're in opposition, in government we deliver on the priorities of our communities, and in opposition we advocate to government for those priorities. But those priorities have to be built on a plan. That plan has to make sense. It has to make sense fiscally, and it has to make sense in terms of the educational outcomes of those schools as well. So consistently I've watched, and you know, because I believe that these decisions are to be made at the local level, I've watched a number of 409 processes unfold at my riding level over the years. It's only been the last maybe 6 or 7 years that I've become more and more frustrated with the way those 409 processes start to unfold. And here's the way the community views 409 and the way that it's implemented. That the district and the DEC propose closing a school or reconfiguring schools, and they present a proposal to the community that this is what they're going to do, and basically you've got 6 months to tell the district education council whether they're right or they're wrong, but we're probably going to do it anyway. And then it goes off to the minister for approval. And ministers are not inclined to override those local DECs because they believe that that's where the decisions should be made. The problem is in the perception, or in some cases the actual lack of engagement that takes place through that process. Now, I want to talk very briefly about the consultation process, Madam Speaker, because I think that consultation process in many cases is where 409 tends to break down. And it very clearly states in Policy 409, and I've read Policy 409 from beginning to end several times over the last number of months, but it very clearly says that there should be a minimum of 3 meetings. It doesn't say it can be limited to 3 meetings, yet that tends to be what districts tend to do, is simply have 3 meetings. They show up, they tell the community, this is what we're thinking of doing. You've got a couple of weeks and we're going to come back and you've got a chance to tell us whether we're right or we're wrong. But if you've got any other ideas, they'll tell you, we're all ears. And then they take that information and they go away. You got to understand, though, Madam Speaker, these in many cases are parents who are busy, and to try and do the kind of research that they're being asked to do in that short period of time, in some cases is very restrictive. And the other issue that I have with the 409 process as it exists today is that the DEC is the proponent of the options that they put in front of the community, and yet they're the ones leading the facilitation. That in itself, Madam Speaker, is a conflict. I would argue when we do a review of Policy 409, one of the biggest recommendations that I would have is that we need an independent, facilitated process for that discussion to take place. Because what you have are the people who have come up with this idea or suggestion, and they're up in front of the room taking questions and defending their option, as opposed to an independent facilitator in front of the room taking that information and working with it. That would be one of the main concerns that I would have with Policy 409. In my own case in St. John over the last number of years, and I guess really about 2 years ago when, for the second time in a decade, the District Education Council proposed the closure of Lawrence School. Now, Lawrence School was the newest school infrastructure in the city of St. John. It was built in 1983, and it was a middle school. And the DEC made a recommendation, which they followed through on, to close that school. Now, they're making an argument now in the proposal that they put before the community that we've got old infrastructure that needs to be replaced, and we need a middle school. And yet just 2 years ago, they closed the newest school in the district that happened to be, or at least in the city of St. John, that happened to be a middle school. So you can see where, through this process, there's been some great frustration on behalf of many of the parents and other community stakeholders. Now, the other issue that I fundamentally have with 409 is districts, and I don't know what it's like across the province, but I can certainly attest to this with my own district, is they believe this is the only engagement tool that they have to engage people in the community about the future of these schools. Now, what they did this past year was they went out and hired a consulting firm, Ernst & Young, to look at 7 schools, unprecedented, that you would look at 7 schools at one time. They had Ernst & Young come up with a report that gave 2 or 3 options that suggested some schools close, others be reconfigured, and they gave them a set of guidelines, one of which was we need a huge inner-city middle school to replace some of our old infrastructure. And what it will mean is some community schools and some priority neighbourhoods in our riding and in adjacent ridings as well may have to close down, and those students may have to go outside their community to attend school. But these were the guidelines that they gave the consulting firm. Now, those guidelines were set without any previous consultation with the community. There wasn't any conversation with community planners. There wasn't a conversation with poverty reduction groups. You know, I've been at some DEC meetings where they've made the statement, well, it's not up to us to decide where communities are going to expand and grow because we're not an economic development agency. Well, Madam Speaker, the days of government departments and organizations like school districts working in silos without talking to other government agencies and departments has to come to an end. There is only one taxpayer, and we have to get this right. If we're going to invest in the priorities of our community. And I want to state very clearly, with respect to our own situation in St. John, I haven't heard one parent yet say that they agree with that the status quo should remain. But what they are asking for is appropriate consultation in the process going forward. What they take exception to is hiring a consulting firm, coming up with recommendations based on guidelines that the community didn't have any input in developing, and then coming back to the community and saying, here are our options, tell us what you think. For 7 schools, it's too massive an undertaking to accomplish through Policy 409. It's too cumbersome to do in that method. And what I get really frustrated with is when these districts, as I said a moment ago, these districts continue to say, well, it's the only process that Fredericton gives us. And we can't go out and consult people before we start a 409 process. Well, I don't buy that, Madam Speaker. And that's why I say that this is a combination of misunderstanding, misuse, as well as a policy that needs to be updated. Because this idea that elected members, the DEC members, can't go out and consult people in their communities and talk to community planners and talk to poverty reduction organizations and consult them before you develop a series of guidelines that you give to a consulting firm that you hire. This idea that they can't do that because there's no mechanism under 409 by which they can do it, it would be like all of us in this assembly saying we can't have a town hall meeting with our constituents because there's no legislative mechanism to allow for that. And that's ludicrous. So I have concerns that the policy is outdated, that it needs some refreshing with respect to the fact that, as I said a minute ago, that the proponent of the options is facilitating the consultation process. I have a problem with that. I have a problem with this idea that 409 is the only way that they can engage the community. And if it is, and if somebody can demonstrate to me how under 409 that's the case, then 409 definitely needs to be fixed. Because going out, in our case in St. John, and trying to reconfigure, build new, potentially close a whole bunch of schools without proper engagement ahead of time doesn't work. Nobody in our community at this point feels that they've had any appropriate input leading up to this process. Now, some of the parents were given a heads up days before this was released, but that's after the consulting firm was hired. That's after the consulting firm were given guidelines. Where those guidelines came from, that basically were constructed around the idea that we need a new middle school in St. John, even though they just closed one 2 years before. Where those guidelines came from, nobody knows. And it's never been properly explained to the community. So my question is, if the district had the authority to go out and develop guidelines without consulting the community, then why couldn't they have gone out and consulted them? They didn't use the 409 process in any way to develop those guidelines. And it goes back to my point that we need some proper education, I believe, around how 409 is implemented. And, you know, when I look at the 8 criteria that are laid out in Policy 409, you know, it talks about economic development concerns, social development concerns. And if I go back to the Lawrence School process of a couple of years ago, there is nothing that I ever heard coming from the district or even on the floor of this legislature that ever made me believe that those considerations were taken into account. Because the province of New Brunswick decided just 6-7 years ago, or whenever it was, the first time the district tried to close that school, that there were very specific reasons why that community needed a school as an anchor in that community. And yet none of those concerns seem to be taken into account later on. Madam Speaker, I believe this is another one of those cases where we can all work together in this House. This is an opportunity to modernize or replace, whatever the case may be, a policy that we've all had frustration with. Every one of us in this House. And I know there's members opposite that have had frustration with the way this policy rolls out. What we need is a policy that the local community through the District Education Council can use to develop a plan for their schools going forward. That's community-owned and community-led, and then it's our job as provincial politicians to champion the priorities as part of that plan. And I'm going to give you an example in my last 2 minutes here, Madam Speaker. A decade ago, in St. John, Princess Elizabeth School was deemed by the district to be replaced. There was design work money in the budget in 06-07 for a new school. And for whatever reason, when the government changed, that priority seemed to change. What we need, and the reason we all need to work together to change this policy, is we need a process at the community level so that a community, and I'm going to keep using the St. John example, we need the citizens of St. John to be able to design a plan for our community, for schools, for the next 10, 20, 25 years and beyond, so that we make the investments that we need to make, but it's a community-owned plan, and if the government changes, the plan continues because the community says we had some involvement in this. And with this current 409 process, there is no appropriate engagement for the community to feel like they've had their say in that. Not when a district can go out and hire a consulting firm on a set of guidelines without any consultation previous from the community. So, Madam Speaker, what we're asking for on this side of the House is another opportunity, and we've had a couple of those opportunities in the last number of days, where this Assembly has worked together. There's nobody at fault here. This isn't one government versus the other. This is a policy that's been in place, as I said at the onset, over 5 premiers. Let's fix it. Let's modernize it. Let's do it so we get the educational outcomes that we need for this generation and beyond. Thank you.
La parole est au ministre de l'Éducation et du Développement de la petite enfance.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Merci beaucoup. Today I rise in the House to speak on Motion 20 regarding Policy 409, Madam Speaker. And I'm pleased to speak today about our government's commitment to providing the best education for children and youth